All right, here we go with Chapter 9, Cellular Respiration and Fermentation. This is a way of taking the things that we learned in Chapters 7 and 8 about membrane structure and function, about enzymes and thermodynamics and energy, and we're going to put them all together when we talk about cellular respiration and fermentation, how cells make ATP, which they can use for energy coupling. So here we can see we've got a mitochondrion. Here's a more artistic representation of a mitochondrion. Here are some yeast cells that are going through fermentation. Here's some bread that was made through fermentation. Here's the citric acid cycle. Here's ATP synthase. So these are all topics we're going to cover and more. So we know that living cells require energy from outside sources. So the ultimate source of energy in any given ecosystem, any given terrestrial ecosystem, is going to be the sun, providing solar energy or sunlight. And ultimately, we know that every ecosystem has transformations of energy and transfers from one form to another. And we know that entropy exists, so ultimately, there's going to be a lot of heat produced, which is a not useful form of energy. So we're increasing the entropy of the universe by generating heat. Photosynthesis, which we're going to talk about in Chapter 10, produces oxygen gas, O2, and organic molecules, both of which can be recycled in cellular respiration. Cells use the chemical energy stored in organic molecules or in our food to regenerate ATP. ATP we saw in the last chapter, how that can be used to turn endergonic processes into exergonic processes through energy coupling. So here's a cartoon showing how in any given ecosystem we have light energy entering the ecosystem. Plenty of light energy gets showered upon the earth every day. Just an amazing amount of energy. More than life on earth can possibly actually use. But fortunately there's enough there. We're getting showered with enough energy every day that it can keep ecosystems working and transforming that light energy into organic molecules and oxygen gas by photosynthesis in things like chloroplast that we find in green plants. Green plants and other eukaryotes can then use those organic molecules and that oxygen to perform cellular respiration in mitochondria. And the products of that cellular respiration are carbon dioxide and water and ATP to power cellular work, but the process is not entirely efficient. We know that it can't be because that would violate the second law of thermodynamics. So a lot of that energy ultimately leaves the ecosystem, increasing the entropy of the universe as heat energy. So cellular respiration is a catabolic or breaking down process. And the way that we use this breakdown is by taking a relatively complex organic fuel like glucose and breaking it down to simpler molecules like carbon dioxide and water. And what we're going to find in this chapter and next is that a lot of these energy transfers have to do with the transfer of electrons, or E-. So we have actually four key pathways in common eukaryotic aerobic cellular respiration. So we start off with glycolysis, or the first initial breaking of sugar to form a molecule called pyruvate, also known as pyruvic acid. That pyruvic acid is going to be oxidized so that it can be fed into the citric acid cycle. And ultimately, those electrons that we are taking off through oxidation are going to end up in a process called oxidative phosphorylation. So we can boil down aerobic respiration to a very simple formula. Pretty simple here. So we've got carbohydrates like glucose that we know is C6H12O6. And we can take oxygen and we can produce carbon dioxide, water, ATP, and because it's not entirely efficient, some heat is produced as well. And you can see that this arrow is only pointing from left to right, suggesting that it's not a reversible process. And the reason that it's not a reversible process is because there's so many steps along the way that we really have it only going in one direction in the mitochondria, in the cell. And while we can say, well, this is the formula for respiration, we're going to find out that it's really quite a complex process, and that there's a lot of steps that occur between just burning glucose and producing ATP. Just like in The Lord of the Rings, we could summarize the entire story with Frodo throws a ring into a volcano. And that would be it. That would be the end of the story. But the entire trilogy is a much longer and more elaborate version of this story of throwing a ring into a volcano. So we know one does not simply throw a ring into a volcano. There has to be a lot of explanation that goes on behind that story. And the vehicle for getting energy out of glucose is electron transfer. And chemical reactions that involve electron transfer are called redox reactions, which is short for oxidation and reduction. So what's happening is that electrons are being transferred from one molecule, our organic fuel, our glucose, and other carbohydrates, to other molecules. So this electron transfer is where we are harvesting the energy. And we use those electrons ultimately to produce ATP. So we take electrons that have a certain amount of potential energy, we transfer them to elsewhere, and we release a relatively electron poor form of carbon. So we take an electron-rich form, we convert it to an electron-poor form, and we use the potential energy in those electrons as our way of producing ATP. So chemical reactions in which we transfer electrons are called redox reactions because one substance is going to be oxidized, it's going to lose electrons or electron density, and another substance is going to gain electrons or electron density, and we say that it is reduced. So the thing that's actually being reduced in reduction is the amount of positive charge. So you might think that gaining something, why do we say that we're reducing it? The answer is because the more electrons you gain, the more negative your charge is. All right? So our mnemonic device for this is oil rig, which stands for oxidation is loss of electrons, and reduction is gain of electrons. So let's look at a fairly simple example. Okay, so we looked back in chapter 2, talking about the emergent properties of substances like sodium, the explosive metal, and chlorine, the poisonous gas, which when these form ions and complete their valence shells, sodium becomes a positive ion because it loses an electron. Chlorine becomes a chloride ion by gaining an electron. So in this case, we'd say that the sodium atom has become oxidized because it's lost an electron, and the chloride ion is reduced because it has gained an electron. So in general, we can say in any situation, a substance that loses an electron or loses electron density is being oxidized, and a substance which gains an electron is becoming reduced. And I often think about, another way to think about this is what is the most electronegative element that is biologically relevant? And the answer is oxygen. So the thing that likes to pull electrons away from other things more than anything else is oxygen. So much so that we've named the process of stripping electrons oxidation, after oxygen. So it is not always the case that an atom has to lose the electrons outright to become oxidized or to gain electrons necessarily to become reduced. So if we burn methane, methane is our simplest hydrocarbon, CH4. We know that hydrogen and carbon are roughly similar in their electronegativity. So when they're sharing electrons in a covalent bond, that sharing is more or less equal. The electrons are going to spend about half their time with hydrogen, about half their time with carbon. Okay, and we know that oxygen, like we just said, it's really greedy for electron density, strongly electronegative. But in oxygen gas, you've got two oxygen atoms that are duking it out, that are fighting for electron density. So they end up sharing because neither of those oxygen atoms is stronger than the other and is able to wrestle the electrons to its side of the molecule. Okay, so if we burn methane, what happens? We get carbon dioxide, we release some energy, and we also get some molecules of water out of this. And we see that the electrons have not necessarily gone away. All of these molecules have filled valence shells, and all of they're at bonding capacity. But what's happened? So in carbon dioxide, those two oxygen atoms are now sharing pairs of electrons with a carbon atom. But now that the oxygen is sharing with that carbon atom, it's saying, yay, I get to pull those electrons away from the carbon. So the carbon atom is getting relatively little electron density, whereas the oxygen atoms are now able to pull more electron density towards themselves. And the same is true with the hydrogens in water. We know that in water, oxygen holds a lot of the electron density, and hydrogen has hardly any electron density. So what's becoming oxidized? The carbon atom is becoming oxidized as it goes from methane to carbon dioxide. And oxygen is becoming reduced when it goes from oxygen gas, O2, to the oxygen that's present in water. So it's the atoms that are becoming reduced and oxidized, not necessarily the molecules. So what we're going to see as we go through the process of cellular respiration is that our carbohydrate fuel, glucose, is going to get oxidized. We're going to strip electron density away from the carbon in glucose. And ultimately, oxygen is going to get reduced. Oxygen is going to pull electron density away from other molecules and become reduced. So here we've got glucose, which starts off as a fairly reduced form of carbon, and it's going to get oxidized in CO2 because it's having to share its electrons with two oxygen atoms. And the oxygen in oxygen gas gets reduced as it gets to share electrons with hydrogen, which can't pull the electron density away. So those electrons are going to spend most of their time with oxygen, and we're going to get a huge release of energy.